Welcome back. This is session number 3 of the 2017 Virtual Genealogy Fair. This lecture is entitled From the Cradle to the Grave, Birth, Childhood, and Death in the National Archives at St. Louis by presenters Daria Lubinsky and Kara Moore. They will deliver an overview of data available from the National Archives at St. Louis that provides biographical details from birth to death, illuminating entire lifespans. Ms. Lubinsky is an archivist and Ms. Moore is an archives technician for the National Archives at St. Louis, Missouri. I am now turning the broadcast over to Daria Lubinsky and Kara Moore.
Hi, I'm Daria Lubinsky, and I'm going to talk to you about children in the National Archives at St. Louis today. First slide, please. Next slide, next slide, next slide. Thank you. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the National Archives at St. Louis. We are not a regional facility like the National Archives in Chicago or Kansas City. We are a national facility. We have more than 600,000 cubic feet of archival personal data records. We share a building with the National Personnel Record Center, and that holds military and civilian personnel service records for people who work for the federal government. And you might have heard something about a fire that happened in 1973 at the National Personnel Record Center at our old building elsewhere in St. Louis, and Ashley Cox is going to be talking about that at her presentation, which comes on after hours. These are some of the series I'm going to discuss today. Normally when people hear of personnel records, they think about adult relatives, but many of the things we have in our collections relate to children. The ones I'm going to talk about here feature stories of paternity, baptisms, and dependence. Then I'll discuss how I use clues from these documents to dig deeper into some of the families using information I found here to do research online, including on Ancestry.com. This little child was recently featured on Archives Cute Twitter feed. This is from the JFK Library, and this baby grew up, and it was at the time, Ernest Hemingway. Next slide. The Army General Court Martials have some really interesting material in them. Grisly crimes and public drunkenness, horse theft, people got court-martialed for punching a telephone operator, somebody got kicked out for lying about bedwetting when they enlisted, and I'm going to talk about this one specific record. This is Staff Sergeant Cosmos J. Rose, who was stationed with the Army Expeditionary Forces in Germany after World War I. He was with the Army Medical Department. He was court-martialed because he married a German woman, and you were not allowed to marry someone who was a German citizen unless you had permission from your commanding officer. The woman he married was named Fraulein Louise Volkland, and she was 3 months pregnant at the time of the court-martial in November of 1921. He argued that, his argument was that she was pregnant, and so he married her because that was the right thing to do. But the Army found that permission to marry is not dependent upon a state of pregnancy, and that a state of pregnancy does not of itself establish the right of marriage. So he was found guilty because he forged letters signed by his commanding major in order to be able to marry. The court-martial also contains some other useful records that you would be interested in if you're looking for genealogy information, including a birth certificate and a citizenship certificate, and details about his Army status. So I went to Ancestry.com and did a little more research, and that's where I found this photo of him. There's a family tree that he's in on Ancestry. Next slide, please. I also found U.S. passport application from December 30th, 1921, and it's for Louise Volkland, and it says she was married and that her husband's name was Cosmos Rose, and that he was a native-born American, and it lists references to corroborate his information and includes the name of his father and the age of his father and his address, and also the name of another reference and a name of his uncle who was in San Jose, California. And then I found that this passport's date was December 30th, and the marriage certificate was dated December 29th, which means they got married the day before she got the passport. Then I also found Louise V. Rose on the New York passenger lists, and that document mentions that she was married and she was from Germany and she was going to live in Fort Slocum, New York in the United States. So another interesting thing on this record is that his uncle's last name was Sousa, and if you look at the next slide, we have the record of John Philip Sousa, who was not his uncle, but I thought that was kind of an interesting coincidence. We have John Philip Sousa's record, and on it, it mentions his name and his children's names. His children were actually grown at the time he was filing for benefits here. But the VA would provide benefits for minor children and education for adult children up to a certain point, and also children who couldn't work could continue to be dependents. And if you want to look at earlier virtual genealogy fair presentations, you could find more information about the XC claim files. Next slide. I'm going to talk about this one claim file for Charles Emery Withrow, who was with Company H as part of the Rainbow Division, which was called that because there were people from all different ethnic backgrounds in it during World War I. He was born in 1904 and he died October 15th, 1918. He died of the influenza in the Great Influenza Epidemic. He was at the time stationed at the disciplinary barracks in Fort J, New York, because he had gotten court-martialed because he was drunk and was on guard duty and he let a prisoner go into an unauthorized place. So he got 3 years imprisonment. So these letters are from a case that dealt with his dependents after he died. His common law wife was named Louise Wunsch, and she, at the time, common law marriage, still is I guess, was legal in Ohio, and so she was claiming she wanted widow's benefits, and also she wanted benefits for their child. This letter that we have here was one of many letters that was in this record, he was a great writer. He wrote very romantic love letters. He wrote poetry. He doesn't write much about serving on the front, though he did. He just says, I don't think I'm going to have to go, and the next thing you know, he's overseas. So, and then he comes back and says, I hope I don't have to do that again. But anyway, so the part I've highlighted here is something they use to help establish paternity for the child, and it says, I will send $15 and the government will send $20 at the same time, and when our dear little one is born, you get $40 and I get $15, then I will send some of it because I don't need much money, so I'll be okay with $5. It's very cute. Anyway, so there was this paternity case, and Louise's lawyer was arguing that the law held any offspring of a married couple, the spouse was legally the father, whether or not, in fact, he was the father. There was this paternity claim in these documents. What ended up happening was the case was made moot because he got the dishonorable discharge, so that you don't get benefits if you have dishonorable discharge. So I found a little more information about her in Ohio County Marriages on Family Search, and it shows Louise Wunsch was born in 1902, and she remarried, and she married a man named Roscoe Dreyer in 1923, and the 1930 census shows they had a 12-year-old daughter named Helen, born in 1918. Now, at the time of Charles's life, the baby's name was Emeretta after him, which was kind of cute, but then the baby was renamed after he died. Next slide. These are the immortal chaplains. I'm going to talk about the chaplain files, which have, in addition to reports on marriages, funerals, and funerals, they also have baptisms, and they also list masses. The chaplains would have to report every month on what they did on wherever they were serving. And these chaplains were 4 chaplains who went down on the USS Dorchester when it was torpedoed by a German U-boat in 1943, and they're on a staff now, and Steve Smith gave a presentation about this back in 2014, if you want to learn more about it. Next slide. So I found this baptism recorded in the chaplain file of a chaplain named Dwight Wilcher, and it was from April 1945, his monthly report. and he was stationed down in San Angelo, Texas, at an airfield. This says that Mary Susan Duval was born May 6, 1944, in Effingham, Illinois, that she was baptized April 1st in San Angelo Army Airfield in San Angelo, Texas. It lists her parents' names. It says what her father's rank was and where he was living, and it lists his wife's name, and it also lists her maiden name, Rexwinkle, so that's useful. And it also lists the name of witnesses, which in this case were people stationed with him, but in some cases can be relatives, so that can also be useful information. This picture on the left, I found her yearbook picture in Ancestry.com. She was from the University of Houston, and that's Mary Susan when she grew up. Next slide, please. Official military personnel files. You may know that the fire of 1973 destroyed about 16 million to 18 million Army and Air Force military personnel files, but we have quite a few that still exist, including some that were burned, some that weren't burned, and all of the Navy records, Marine Corps records, and Coast Guard records were not involved in the fire, so we have full runs of those. We even have a record of Private Paget, this Marine mascot, who is featured with these paw prints. His record is in our custody. OMPFs often contain copies of birth and baptism certificates of either the veteran or of his beneficiaries. Next slide, please. This is Walter Lewis Hampton. This is an early photo of him. He was a boatswain's mate, second class, and there are letters in here regarding support for his dependent children. His wife had written to the military and said her husband was not providing for his children, and she claimed desertion. And he said she was living with another man, and this is what the letter says. You claim that I have not supported you and the children for 3 years, which is true. The reason for not supporting you and the children was because you and Mr. F.W. Hogue moved so much that I could not keep up with you. I asked your sister what your address was. Everything was kept a secret. What could I do? Then the next paragraph says, Jane, do you still want me for a husband and father for our children, or do you still prefer Mr. Hogue? I am more than willing to make a home for you and the children if you wish it so. Well, they reconciled, and the way we know that is because when Walter was killed in the bombing of the torpedoing of the USS Arizona in December 7th, 1941, he was a casualty of that, and they were listed as beneficiaries to his insurance payments after he died. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit here now about civilian records. Kara Moore will talk more about civilian records also later. We have many different series. If there are handouts that include the list of all the different series we have personnel files for. This one I'm going to talk about is Harry Walsh. He was with the Department of State, and this is from his official personnel folder, which was very large. Mr. Walsh was an attorney who worked in various consulates as a clerk, a stenographer, and a consul. He was in Cuba, Mexico, Panama, and Canada between 1905 and 1933. There are a lot of mentions of his family in these records as the number of kids grew from 4 to 7. And there is actually also a mention of the fact that his wife lost a child when they were on a ship going from one of his posts to another, and how she was very depressed about this. That was in 1923. Many of the records mention how poor the family was. One of them mentions that he was Catholic and that the family was very large, that they lived shabbily. They list the ages of the children when they were born in these records, also the names of all the children on certain records. And there is one mention also that the family could barely speak English. That was when they were stationed in Panama. Next slide, please. These next records are the Project J files, which have a long name, Casualty File and Missing Persons Act claim files. They were generated to maintain a record of claims by individuals who were detained or killed by the Japanese while residing and or working in the South Pacific when captured during World War II. You don't normally think about children being prisoners of war. Well, they were. In February of 1942, the Santo Tomas internment camp had 400 children, and by February 45, when the camp was liberated, there were 2,132 children there, including babies who had been born while in captivity. There are photos of these available online and in National Archives holdings, and some of them are very sad. There is a story that This American Life, the podcast, did on radio a few years ago, and I included a link to that on the slides. And it mentions some children who were POWs, and they are interviewed about how they coped. Next slide, please. One of the children's records I found was Sasha Jean Weinsheimer, and she had a brother named Walter in this picture, but only Sasha had a file with her name on it. Walter was mentioned in her father's file, and sometimes on the parents' files it'll just say boy or girl, it won't even give the names. But this one gave some information. It mentions that her occupation was a student. It mentions her age at the time she was liberated in 1945 was 12, and it says where she was, her legal residence, when she was born and where, and that she was a citizen of the United States. And then on the back, like I said, the funny thing is it mentions she's single as her marital status, which is, since she's 12, that's good. And on the back it says she was a student. Now this photo, according to an interview I found of Sasha Jean on the internet, was taken by the Japanese, and it was taken to show that she and her brother were doing well and that everything was okay in the camps and the kids were fine. But there are many other photos that show a totally different story. Next, please. Oh, and I just want to mention, I also found her on Ancestry because they have later information about her, such as her marriage, and her yearbook photo is on there. And the last record series I'm going to talk about is another set of official personnel folders called the Records of the Panama Canal. These were people who were employed down in the Panama Canal area from 1904 to 1951. This is an interesting one because I wanted to find more information about this, and I kept striking out. This woman's name was Lilith de Caceres, and this record shows that she had 2 dependent children. And the record is dated from 1920, and it shows the children are born in 1915 and 1918, so they were quite young. But she was a widow at the time that she was working for the Panama Canal. It shows that she was a saleswoman, and it shows that she earned $60 a month, and that she worked from February to December of 1920 at the concessionary stand or the military concession thing. I'm drawing a blank on what it's called. Commissary. There it is. Commissary. And she earned $60 a month doing that. And it also gives her address of where she lived and worked. So I tried to find more information about her. I was very curious about what happened to the children. And I really was striking out, and it turns out, so I had all these questions, like maybe she was married in Panama, maybe de Caceres was her maiden name. This document shows that an A. Lipman was her nearest relative, so maybe Lipman was her maiden name. I couldn't find hits in the census, and I couldn't find hits for her aunt in the census. And I looked on Ancestry International, and I looked on Google, and I was having no luck. So then what I ended up doing was, next slide, I saw that it said Redlands, California, and that she was, how old she was at the time, which was, I believe, 10, at the time that she came to Panama. Age of last birthday, 28 years old. So I put in the year, it has her birth date, it was 1891. And I put in just her first name in Redlands, California, and I finally got a hit. And what I found was a census record. And the census record shows that in 1890, she was living with Charles and Ada Lipman, which turned out to be her aunt and uncle. They were brother and sister, they weren't married. And her name in the census is Lilith de Castis, not Lilith de Castis, not Lilith de Caceres. And it mentions she was born in Jamaica to Jamaican parents. So another interesting thing I found on this is the census data lists her as being black, and the document from the Panama Canal record lists her as being white. So There's all kinds of information on here. I would probably look at Panama Canal records in College Park. I would try to see if I could find any more Panama Canal genealogy, maybe find an old newspaper or something to just see if I could find more information about this. Kara, I think it's your turn. And at the end of this presentation, we'll give you information about how to request these records. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Kara, and I work at the National Archives with both military and civilian records. So primarily, I'm going to talk about death occurred during federal service. So when thinking of death during service, military service people are often the first that come to mind for obvious reasons. But civilian deaths do occur during federal service, and those deaths are commonly detailed in their official personnel folders. All of the civilian official personnel folders fall under Record Group 146 with a few exceptions. Whether they served during wartime, such as a telephone operator or part of the Women's Air Service pilots, or completing their everyday duties, such as delivering the mail or on travel with the CCC, or in an actively dangerous position, such as a prohibition agent, civil servants can die during service, and the details always become part of their records. Next slide. The first individual I'm going to talk about is Cora Bartlett. She served in the War Department as a telephone operator, which is a textual series of Record Group 146. She also has an individual deceased persons file because she died overseas and was doing war-related work. Like I said, she was a telephone operator, commonly called a hello girl, and she was the only one to actually die while on duty overseas as part of her group. So part of her record shows that she died overseas, what she died from, and who her next point of contact was. This little card shows that the next point of contact is her brother and some more details about getting a hold of him. She died of the Spanish flu, and officially called the typhoid fever, on June 23rd of 1919. And because of the unique circumstances of her death, there are a lot of articles that discuss her being the only female, her being part of the Hello Girl, and some of the different kind of dangers that can come with that. Even though she didn't die in battle, she still had a death overseas while performing her duty. Next slide. These are some notes that were part of her record as working with the War Department. There's a note based on her entire surviving family because they needed to know who to contact and where her remains and effects needed to be sent. So she had a burial that was treated similar to that of a military combat death in this particular situation. And you can see that it lists her brother's names and that her parents are deceased and where they currently were living so that they could be contacted. Next slide. The next individual I'm going to talk about is Nelson Voss. He worked for the Post Office Department, again part of Record Group 146, in a textual document. He served as a substitute mail carrier and clerk. The post office is such a large employer that not every employee had an OPF, and it's very likely that Voss would not have had an OPF had it not been for his death during service. So he died while on the job and carrying his mail route, but it was determined to not be related to his service. His mail route was part of normal day-to-day business carried on in Edwardsville, Illinois. The route that he happened to be on covered a house that former NARA archivist Ashley Mattingly lived on, so that's what drew my attention to him. Next slide. He has a ton of details and source work surrounding the case and the outcome of the case, particular to his death. He was found murdered on his mail route, and similar to military, there's a lot of dependency compensations available to spouses of those who died on duty. The nature of the death included theft of 2 of his packages, and therefore there's statements from the accused, including the packages that were taken and what was in them. you can see that there's a compensation death claim, and there's actually an adjustment that has to be made because of the missing items that he was responsible for as part of his federal service. The small town, doesn't seem like there's a lot of resources, but there's a lot of statements in his OPF that regard the investigations, and they had to be submitted through the Postmaster General, and in order for them to account for closing all these counts and the liabilities and the different claim authorizations that were due to his wife. Next slide. The next person I'm going to talk about is William C. Batley. He was part of the CCC, and the CCC records we have are all on microfilm. They're still part of Record Group 146, but to process these, we have to look at the microfilm and then print them out. He served as a CCC enrollee. He also happened to be a veteran, and he was involved in a fatal motor vehicle accident while at camp. Next slide. The first page you see is his biographic information, and I've pulled out the part that talks about his date of birth, where he was born, where he served, who his next of kin was, and those kinds of details. That's common in every single CCC record, but then you see the veteran stamp at the top. Because he died, in service, there was a full investigation. So that includes different exhibits, different hearings, different testimonies of other people who were around, and you can kind of see a listing of all the different things that were surrounding this and the different individuals who were connected to him at the time of death. Next slide. On the left, there's a little bit of a testimony that I pulled out, and it asks if there was any alcohol intake that was addressed. It's a common question for the boys at the CCC camp, just to know how rowdy they were and where the fault really lied. On the right, you see the map of the accident, which I think is amazing because it's so similar to accident reports that we have to fill out still today. But the record's really, really big, and there's a detail of every statement from every person, from the camp supervisor that allowed them and gave them the pass to have the vehicle, to every person that was in the car and how this situation went and how the night was and whether or not they were safely riding in the back of the truck or not, which definitely we cannot do today. Next slide. The next lady I'm going to talk about is Edith Keene. She was a federal employee with the Department of the Army Air Force. She served with the Women's Air Service pilots. The WASP were employed as civilians during World War II and trained as pilots. So despite the strong military resemblance in her position, she was a federal service employee and not considered military. She was killed in flight as a passenger. This little line that I pulled out is an affidavit talking about her character and how strong of a pilot she was and how reckless she might have been. She was a passenger of a test flight with a second lieutenant pilot, so she was stationed right there alongside the military. Next slide. This is a front and back image of her list of personal effects. Personal effects lists like this are common, and I think it really humanizes the people to see just the day-to-day things that they lived with and had with them in their room, from having different kinds of blushes and lotions to bobby pins to special pins and air service jackets even, which kind of drum up an immediate mental image of a woman with her bomber jacket on. The image to the right is her official end of duty, saying that she was killed in action. She has a separation by death. So I think that these kind of details really personalize the death in service and drive home that these were people that we know and love, and even though they were civilians that died in death, they still went through the same kinds of things that a more common death in service might bring to mind. Next slide. The next is also another WASP. Her name was Hazel Ying Lee. She died in service. There was a landing gear malfunction, and this is an image of the telegraph that was sent, providing a full military burial due to fatality while performing her duty, even though she was training in the coastal United States. Next slide. The next person I'm going to talk about is William Parker. He worked with the Lighthouse Services. They fall under both the Department of Commerce and the Department of the Treasury. They're textual documents in Record Group 146. William Parker was a lighthouse keeper, and it was very common, and still is today, for keepers and their families to live in or very, very near to the lighthouses in order to maintain that constant surveillance, because that constant beam is so vital to incoming and passing ships. So he died in service, though in his home, while being a lighthouse keeper. Next slide. This is an image of the statement that his wife gave. His wife lived with him in the house as lighthouse keepers. She left the post amidst an ice storm in order to try and get some provisions necessary for survival. The storm was so bad that they had been cut off and completely run out of any supplies, as their lighthouse was on an island, so the only way to leave was to try to get a boat through the ice. So she manages to leave. The lighthouse had been left unchecked until there were obvious signs of distress, meaning that the lighthouse went out and the light went down. So after she left, this little piece pulled out and says that we know as we came back, we had a feeling, looking back, that she wasn't going to see her husband alive again, and when she comes back to the island with the provisions and other people to help them, then they find her husband kneeling at the side of his bed as though in prayer, but deceased. Next slide. This is Dale Kearney. He was a Prohibition agent. So Prohibition agents are another one that fall under several different agencies, Department of Justice and Department of the Treasury. It's Record Group 146, not 14, and it's a textual document. Next slide. He was killed in action. He was ambushed while working at a post in Colorado. It was suspected that his murder was a vengeance kill because he had recently completed a very large still seizure and took a lot of people out of business. This is a service record card that gives you a very brief but thorough summary of his service, detailing his beginning of service, how much he made, the promotion, and then when he was killed in action. Next slide. Because he was killed in action, again, there was a full investigation. However, his wife had to supply necessary documentations in order to claim her compensations. She had some complications getting all of these things together, and it kind of delayed her compensation claim requirements. He's another one that had a lot of articles surrounding his death. It was very controversial, so those articles help us piece together the circumstances of his death. However, without his OPF, you don't get a complete picture of everything that happened surrounding it. You don't get details like the funeral bill and where he was buried, which the government did pay for, so that's why there's such a detailed itinerary of the circumstances. Next slide. This one is my bonus guy. He wasn't necessarily killed in action, but he goes missing. This is Ray Sutton. He was a Prohibition agent who just suddenly disappeared one day. Next slide. He disappeared as an active agent while working in New Mexico. There's an ongoing investigation surrounding this missing in action. No body means we can't confirm. And because it's an ongoing investigation, the widow and 2 surviving children continue to suffer from a lack of income. There's no back channel paid. It's kind of being determined. She has to continue to follow up and submit requests for documentation. But while the investigation is going on, they're actually utilizing the records of his OPF to try and confirm his whereabouts. On the left-hand side, the part that's pulled out on the top is his signature page from when he signs into service, and I've got his signature blown up there on the right. And then the bottom image is the final check that he was issued and the endorsement signature that was used. The check was actually cashed a couple weeks after he went missing, and the signatures don't line up. And so that complicates the investigation a little bit, but really shows how important it is to have these documents and see that the OPF helps create a fuller picture surrounding circumstances. Next slide. This is a statement from the widow, and you can see that there's two different letters here, or I'm sorry, there's a letter here that is from 1934, even though he was missing in August of 1930, the widow's still trying to apply and still trying to get the circumstances proven so she can start to get those benefits back to her. The lack of evidence, the total disappearance, means that no case ever goes and it gets tried, so it's very complicated for the widow, but these kind of statements can see that there is a surviving not only wife but 2 children, and give you a little bit more of a view of what happened to this individual and his family surrounding after the death. Next slide. And that's the end of both of our presentations. As Daria promised, this is some information about requesting our records. The National Archives at St. Louis has archivable official military personnel files and official personnel folders and auxiliary records. To be archivable for official military personnel file means that the veteran service ended on today's date, 62 years or prior. It's a sliding date, and anything that's archivable is completely open to the public. If for an archivable official personnel folder, the employee service had to have ended before 1952, and that one's not a sliding date. You can request at these websites provided, and you can also send questions and requests directly to us via email at stl.archives@nara.gov. I have included a link for a list of most of our federal agencies, so if you want to see what kind of agency would be considered a federal agency versus maybe a state agency, there's a short listing there, and as a heads up, our websites are being updated currently, so maybe check back in a little while and you'll see that it's going to be a lot easier for everybody to use. We have some standard reproduction fees. If a record is 5 pages or less, it's only $25. If it's bigger than 5 pages, it's a standard $70. Next slide. You can write in to request your records. You can fax, you can email, and these are some more charges that are for something that would be considered auxiliary or that comes individually paged, or if you were wanting a copy of a photograph or a digital copy. Next page. And you can also come to our site. We have a research room that people are welcome to come in and set up by appointment and view the documents that are available in person or make their own copies and do the research here. You can visit our webpage to find more information specifically about our research room. They can also be reached by telephone and email, and you're more than welcome to set up an appointment, and then we'll look for the records and let you come in and look at them if we find them. Next slide. That's it. Thank you for attending. We're going to do questions now.
Thank you, Kara. Thank you, Daria. This is Andrea in Washington, D.C. If we can go back to the video so we can see you while I queue up the questions, that would be wonderful. We'd like to see your smiling faces if possible. So, first question, where are the court-martial records before 1939? I am interested in the 1870s.
They should be in Washington, D.C., the National Archives there.
Okay, so they can still access those, the actual records. Thank you.
Yes. Go to the catalog and just search for Army Branch of Service and the Court Martial, and you should be able to find them.
Thank you. Okay, going way back to the start of your presentation on the slide number 9, we had several people remark, it looks like Withrow was 14 years old when he died. Is that correct? 14?
Oh, do I have the wrong date listed? No, he was not 14 when he died. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
You know, how many times we looked at that slide? I'll have to get back on that. Sorry, I'd have to look it up. It's on one of the documents.
No problem. We just have some sharp, eagle-eyed researchers who are used to looking for things. So on to the next question. I think another researcher responded, but they asked which archives building would have record group 153.2.3. And it sounds like it's the textual materials in DC.
Yeah,
And
that's what I would think.
okay, we just wanted to make sure.
Do you know what the record group is? I mean, what's the series called?
This is Andrea. I actually have to look that up. I'm busted.
Okay.
I don't know them off the top of my head either. I will come back to you. Let's come back to that question. So Brittany's going to help me with that. Next question. You had chaplain records. Someone asked, do they include rabbis?
Yes, they do. Yes, and those 4 chaplains who went down on the ship, one of them was a rabbi.
Okay, thank you so much. Next question is, how are the OPFs archived? By person or by agency or by both?
They are first archived by agency, so we need to know the agency the individual worked for, and then they're alphabetical within the agency group. The only exception to that is the WPA records. They're organized by WPA and then by location of employment. So we need to know specifically where the person worked, and then they're alphabetical.
Wonderful. And then the follow-up question to that is, if it's by person, is it St. Louis or agents, the regional archives?
Nope. Just like Daria said at the beginning, we have everything. We have every federal employee across the nation. It doesn't matter location. We've got all of the records here. We are a national personnel record center.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions about the Project J files. The Project J files also contain information on non-U.S. citizens, children who were in Japanese internment camps during World War II.
Yes, they should. But like I said, some of the records, not every child has a record, but sometimes their parents have records, so they are included.
Okay, thank you.
And also the intermarriage, you'll see quite a few of those where somebody's spouse was Filipino.
Okay, thank you. Going back to, they say slide 21 on Nelson Voss, it says SIG C is marked through. Is that a notation for signal corps? Signal corps.
I would assume, without looking at it in front of me, can you tell me the slide number again?
I think it was slide number 21.
It's really small on our handout, so she's not going to be able to see it.
I couldn't make it out either.
My gut instinct is to say no, that it probably had something to do with the case, so maybe it was significant exhibit number C because of the letter itself. It wouldn't have really, I don't know why they would have notated that specifically. So that's why my gut instinct is to say no, because it sounded like irrelevant information to him and any documents surrounding his death.
Fair enough. Thank you. Next question. If the employee's employment ended 1960, that's 8 years shy of the 52-year time frame, are those OMPFs accessible still?
Those would be OPFs that they're talking about, and they are just considered non-archivable. We have the records. They're either here or at our annex in Valmeyer, Illinois, but those aren't open to the public, so you'd have to be next of kin or subject to FOIA to gain access to those records.
Thank you. A basic question. Let's go back if someone missed it. So each agency would have their own OMF if the person worked for many agencies?
Yes and no. It is, without going into a very detailed description of my job, it's very possible that they have separate OPFs, official personnel folders, for each agency. It's also possible that at one point their records have been combined because they get sent to the next agency. When we do a search, we try to look through the history of the individual and see if there had been prior government employment, which is notated on most applications. And if that happens, we will go and search and make sure that we're providing as complete a copy of the records as possible, and invoice for any individual agency record we can find. Any and every.
Nicely done. Thank you. Our next question, this person says, I am having trouble finding records for an ancestor who died on an ironclad serving in the Navy, not Army, during the Civil War. What do you recommend?
We don't have records that date back to the Civil War. Those are located in D.C. It's unfortunately also possible that despite them being on an Army or Navy carrier ship, that they weren't aboard this ship in a federal capacity. So it's possible that they don't have a record. We could have a burial file maybe if they were lost at sea. But
probably not for Civil War.
Yeah, that doesn't sound
No.
right to me.
No.
It would be for later.
Mhm.
But most records that date back to that are located in D.C. and College Park.
Great, thank you. So we have a question about chaplain records. What information would I need about my father's service to find the chaplain's record for the baptism of my sister?
Good question.
That's a good question. We have an index to chaplain files that theoretically you could look up the name and it would show you the chaplain and then you could go from there. But it is not 100% accurate. We've tried that sometimes and not been able to find them. Sometimes you can find information about chaplains on the internet and where they were, and so if you knew where your father was stationed, you could, or even you could look at a history of the base sometimes if he was stationed in a base, and you could find out that way who the chaplain was. I mean, there is, if you do some digging, usually you should be able to find a chaplain's name, and then you could go from there and find the record of the baptism or funeral or marriage. I found my uncle's. My uncle was killed in World War II, and I found his burial by. He actually was in the cards, the chaplain cards, by last name, so I was able to find the record of his burial and by finding the chaplain's name.
Sounds like you lucked out. That's nice.
I did.
That's right by the last name. Thank you. Next question. Can I view my father's World War II naval records in St. Louis?
More than likely, unless he was in a later service and didn't get out before the 62-year cutoff date. It's open to the public. Anybody can look at it. You can make an appointment. You can request it in advance because we are very large and it can take a while to search a record. But our Navy records are not burned, so you should be able to see it in fairly quickly.
Okay, thank you. Question going back to the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. If I have his serial number, are there likely to be more records there?
No. Asked and answered. No, they're not organized by serial number.
Okay.
Unfortunately, the CCC records have all been placed on microfilm and the originals destroyed. So if we do an alpha search for the individual on the microfilm and we don't find it, we do a secondary search to see if he was ever promoted to serve in a leadership capacity, which means that he would have been paid from one of the agencies that were associated, Department of the Army Air Force, Department of the Interior, etc. And we do search those records as well to see if there's anything related to CCC service. But having a serial number doesn't make the likelihood of the search any more positive. If we hit a negative, it doesn't always mean that he didn't serve. It just means that we don't have the record. Some of the different camps and barracks that house the CCC records have had fires, have gotten lost in transport, so it might just not have been translated onto microfilm back in the day.
Back in the day, yes. Thank you. For someone who might be just starting out looking for their family's records, They want to know, how do you even begin? It sounds like this person knows that they had family in military personnel records, but they don't know where, because they're like, how do you know that they were in the CCC? And then she follows up and asks, you know, would you look in St. Louis or somewhere else at the National Archives? Where do you even begin?
It's a very complicated question.
It is.
We can do quite a few searches with names, full names, dates of birth, and locations of birth and dates of death. We get those kind of requests a lot. It helps. The more information you have, the more it helps. But you never know what, it really depends.
Yeah, I would say shoot us an email with the email we provided, and give us as much information as you know relevant to their biographic information and what kind of service they might have had, and then we'll just conduct a search from there and give you a positive or negative.
Okay, thank you. This is an interesting question about women who have served. The question is, would women in World War II have their records stored separately from the men, or did their records get burned?
They would have got burned. If they were in all the records would have been together. They weren't separated. So in the things Kara's talking about where it was civilian, then those are not going to be affected. But if it was somebody who was actually in service, we would
subject to the same file.
Yes, it's the same rules. Yeah.
And this is Andrea. I'd like to add that, the very next session, we'll talk about those records that were burned. If you missed that at the beginning of their talk, that stick around. We've got exciting news. Let's see here. I'm looking to see if this is a new question. Looks like it. Civil servants who worked for the Signal Ordnance Corps and Army or Air Force, but through Civil Service Commission, will there be a non-military file and a military file? Would they have both?
It's not impossible. We actually find really commonly that Signal Corps contracted or worked with things like universities, and they are the ones who actually have the records or the papers related to the individual service. But if you submit a request, we'll do the and there's the possibility of civilian federal employment. We'll do a federal employment check, and if there's an indication that we find that there could have been a military affiliation, we'll do that search as well. And if we find something in the military, we'll give you an invoice related to military service. But we kind of do those checks with the jobs that are so closely blurred lines between the two, and we'll be able to determine whether or not there was civilian service or military service or both, which is kind of common. Like I said, with the Signal Corps records, we find that really commonly those folks were contracted, but there are many people who worked in two capacities. Like nurses, they could have been part of the Army Nurse Corps and then continued on with the Public Health Service, which is a civilian position, so they could have both.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I think we have time for one more, and the question, and it might not be a fair one to you, they're asking about how veterans get onto memorials, specifically the World War II memorial. Do you happen to, as a side, not your expertise, I know, but would you know how that the memorial names get memorialized?
I believe there's just a website and forms on a website that you could fill out.
Yeah. Be an individual effort.
For the World War II memorial and also like the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the national memorials, I think you can just go on the internet and find forms. You probably have to submit some kind of proof of service, and that's a lot of what the National Personnel Records Center does. It deals with people who are trying to get some kind of proof of service for records that burned, and that's why we're here, really. Yep. So, and it doesn't, I also wanted to just mention, there's no fee for us to search records.
Right.
So some people think you have to pay just to have a record search. That's not true. That's what your tax money is going toward.
Okay, thank you. I do have one quick question, I think. I'm not sure I'm familiar with this word, Yemenite. They ask, where would I find records for World War I, Yeomenette?
Like a yeoman.
Female.
Yo,
Yemen, right?
Yeah, I think
That
so.
sounds like.
Yeah.
I mean, we have all personnel records, so us.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody's ever searched using that word, like,
Yeah, but they're not
but
organized.
that doesn't mean, it would just be under this person's name.
Yeah, they're not organized by specific position.
Right.
So, I mean, it's helpful for us to know what position they served in so we can confirm that we find the correct record. But they're not organized by position. So if it's a individual personnel record related to the times of service that we hold here, hit us up.
Sure.
okay.
We have there were a lot of women who served in World War I.
Yeah.
It's surprising. It's not something that ever really gets talked
And
about.
that's a civilian title as well, so they could be military or civilian with a title like that.
Yep.
Thank you. Between your answer and the ones we're getting from our expert genealogist, I just personally wasn't familiar with that term. Thank you, everybody. I'm not seeing any more questions right at this time.